Anthony Carnevale is with Georgetown University and the Center on Education and the Workforce Director. This new report, good jobs are back. First in line, college graduates.
Yeah, we've seen a real uptick in the recovery such that we've made about 6.6 million new jobs since the recovery began in 2010. After three pretty grim and dismal years, and the recovery's been very slow. It's been coming on at about half the speed of previous recoveries, but nonetheless, it's performing reasonably well. We've got about 2.9 million good jobs, another 1.8 million jobs in the middle, and then we've got about 1.9 million jobs that pay less than $32,000 a year. Not so good jobs.
But we keep hearing that this is a jobless recovery, that the jobs are not coming back the way they have in past economic recoveries, and then of course we saw what happened on Wall Street last week. Almost a 1,000-point drop in the Dow. Whether that has any impact on jobs remains to be seen.
It has been a very slow recovery. We've recovered at half the rate that we recovered in previous recessions, but we've finally come to the point where we've got all the jobs above $53,000 have come back pretty much to where they were in 2006 and 2007. Not terrific. We lost all the jobs that would have been there if we hadn't had a recession. And the middle jobs are still lagging behind. That's a concern. We're still losing construction jobs, manufacturing jobs, transportation, utilities jobs, faster than we're creating the new middle jobs, which are in healthcare, computers, office functions other than clerical jobs, and so on.
So is that how you define a good job?
A good job for us, and it's a somewhat arbitrary decision, is a job that's in the top third of the jobs, which is to say it's a job that pays at least $53,000 a year. 86% of those jobs are full-time. About 70% of those jobs have some health care provided, and about 60% of those jobs have some kind of employer retirement plan.
You have worked in a couple of capacities in previous administrations, Presidents Reagan and Clinton and Bush. You served on Capitol Hill. What can Congress, what can government do to create these jobs, if anything?
My bias in this is not dissimilar from a lot of economists, and that is, I think we missed an opportunity to begin to repair America's infrastructure. Truthfully, one of the reasons the recovery has been so slow is we didn't stimulate the economy enough. And that's because of very profound disagreements between the political parties in terms of how big the stimulus should be. We could have gone out and built bridges and highways and better railroad tracks in America. That would have been a one-time expense and would have increased job creation dramatically and left us with lots of sturdy infrastructure that would last for 20 and 30 and 40 years.
And yet your report indicates that any economic recovery that we're in right now is still a long way to go. So what will it take to create a better recovery?
I think in the end what we're looking at, given our ability to make policy in this area, essentially the economy is on its own. And probably by 2017, I think, we'll be fully recovered, notwithstanding the risk of God knows how many jolts and shocks the economy can experience in that time. But if things go well, we're on track over the next decade to create about 50 million job openings. 30 million will come from baby boom retirement, and 20 million will actually be new jobs.
Our guest is the director of the Georgetown University Center on Education and the Workforce, and we are dividing our phone lines a little bit differently for this segment. If you are currently employed with one of those good jobs, 202-748-8000. If you are out of work, the number to call is 202-748-8001. And if you're a recent college graduate, as the report indicates, college grads are first in line for those jobs. Here's the number, 202-748-8002. So what are the professions that you would recommend people study or get into where the jobs are going to be growing over the next 5 to 10 years?
It's a new game now. That is, more education is still better in general, but what's different now is that it's what you study that determines what you make in the end. So it's your college major So we know that people who get one-year certificates in something like heating, ventilation, and air conditioning make more than the average college graduate. We know that somebody who is in engineering will make $3 to $4 million more over a career than somebody who studies early childhood education to get their bachelor's degree. So what you have to pay attention to now is your field of study. That matters more, really, than whether or not you get a 2-year degree over a 4-year degree over a graduate degree, which was the old way of doing business.
And the other part of the debate is over whether to increase the minimum wage in terms of what an individual would earn. What impact does that have long term?
The minimum wage increase is more an ideological question than it is an economic one. In the end, it affects relatively few people. In the end, it does reduce hiring, I think, in the low-wage labor market. It really is a question of what we decide as a people the minimum compensation ought to be for people who work full-time. It's more, I think, a social question than an economic one, and the economic impact of raising the minimum wage is relatively small, whether you believe it helps or hurts jobs, and there are people on both sides of that debate.
Let me ask you about Wall Street. Many people say what happens on Wall Street is really a predictor of what's to come down the road. The market down 530 points on Friday, and a lot of indication, not as much of a sluggish American economy, but concerns about China and what's happening with manufacturing over there. So what impact does that have on American jobs, if anything?
The impact is minimal again. The stock market is more like a mood ring. It tells you how people are feeling when they get up in the morning every day. And the fact that the Federal Reserve Board may pull in the money supply, the fact that there's a concern about China and other nations overseas whose economies are slowing down has put us into a bit of a tailspin. My own bias, and I think it's the general bias, is that the fundamentals in the American economy have now achieved a level of momentum such that over the next 4 or 5 years, the stock market should stabilize.
So this could be more of a correction?
I think it's more of a correction. I'm not sure it's the full correction, by the way. You can get a pretty good debate about whether it's half the correction that will occur or whether this is it.
Myra is joining us from Newport News, Virginia. Are you full-time employed, Myra?
Yes, I am.
Go ahead with your question or comment.
Well, I just want to say I've been full-time employed. I have a good job. I've been in the health field for 30-plus years. And it has been recession-proof. And that it's a good field to get into. I just wish more people would take a look at it and check out that route, because it has been a stabilizing force in the economy, I believe. Thank you.
Did you want to respond?
Healthcare is now 20% or a little more of our overall economic output. Almost 20 cents out of every dollar that every American spends now goes to healthcare. It's obviously growing as the country gets older, and jobs in healthcare have grown consistently throughout the recession and the recovery. It's one of those bright spots in the economy. The caller is dead on. That is, healthcare is a very good bet.
This is another tweet from Karen, who says, did the guest mention how many people make $50,000 or more a year with health benefits, with a pension plan, etc.?
We looked at the new jobs that have come online since 2010. That's the year the recovery began, when the jobs started growing again. And there are 2.9 million people among 6.6 million new jobs that have been created. 2.9 million people got those good jobs. Smaller numbers, under 2 million, got the jobs in the middle and the jobs at the bottom. So this is not a recovery with all good jobs. The good jobs are about 44% of the jobs we've created.
We're talking about jobs and the economy. Anthony Carnevale is with Georgetown University. Scott is joining us from San Antonio, Texas. Scott, how long have you been retired?
For a little over 2 years.
Go ahead with your question or comment.
Yes, I think the thing that really interests me more than anything is the fact that the Republicans have just totally ignored And matter of fact, they've gone against this president from day one, as Mitch McConnell initially said before Barack even took office, is that their goal was to make sure that he was a one-term president, and that is exactly what they've done. They've actually, they're always talking about hypocrisy, or rather talking about being loyal citizens or patriots, and these people have actually gone out of their way to try to stifle the growth of the economy by going against everything that this president has tried to do to help the economy out. They've got the lowest rating of a Congress probably that ever existed in the history of this country, and they've just totally, they've totally abandoned even trying to help the economy out just so that they can win the White House back. It just really amazes me. And this man gets no credit for what he's done. And this gentleman here indicated that it would have been better had they put more money into the recovery. And, of course, that, like he said, would have never happened under this Republican Party that we see today. And the thing about it is that I guarantee you, if they do win the White House back, the way that they govern will be entirely different from what they're doing right now. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Scott.
Well, one of the things that I think is reasonably clear is that whoever wins the White House this time, and for that matter the Senate, which is up for grabs as well, will be riding into a fairly bright sunrise in terms of how the economy will perform. So all things equal, whoever wins the political fight in America is going to walk into an economy that's going to make them look good. So a lot of this is an issue as to whether Obama, who I would agree pulled us out of the ditch, did the best he could to do that, whether he'll get credit for that in retrospect, and whether he can pass that credit on to a Democrat who can win the White House. If the Republicans win, they'll be riding a pretty good economy as well. So there's something to be had here in winning the next election, because what you may win is a prosperous economy.
This from another viewer saying, is outsourcing helping or hurting the American worker?
One of the great ironies in economics is that people who benefit from outsourcing and technology change, globalization, are never the same people who lose out to those same forces. So that we know that since the late 90s, that the people who lose out to outsourcing and technology change are males who tend to live in the Midwest, and are blue-collar workers. The big winners are workers, especially females, who live on either coast. So this is a game in which there are winners and losers if you allow an economy to run. The issue is how do we treat the losers, I think, and we don't treat them very well.
And from Dee Dee, who says, specify what qualifies for a good job. Is it strictly wages? And what wage is considered good? Question mark.
We arbitrarily, because there is no official definition of a good job, we just said if your job is in the top third of the jobs, that is to say, that ends up meaning you make more than $53,000 a year. There's an 86% chance then among those jobs that you're working full-time, which most people want to do. There's a 68% chance you got health care from your employer, and there's a 60% chance that you've got some kind of pension program, not to say your employer contributes a lot to it, but you have it. If you think of two people in a two-earner family, each making 53, that's 106 in cash, and then the benefits are worth about 30%. So you're talking about what is really a living wage, a middle-class family wage, if it's a two-earner family, which increasingly all our families are becoming.
The Wall Street Journal is writing about this new report with the headline, Why Job Growth May Not Be As Bad As You Think. In fact, since the recession, the job growth has been led by high-wage occupations. The full story available online at WSJ.com. Tim is joining us from Abington, Virginia. Tim, how long have you been out of work?
About 5 years.
And what did you do before you were laid off?
Maintenance personnel. But one of the things I'd like to talk about infrastructure, I think the railroads are really missing this as far as passenger trains. I think we could use maybe 2 or 3 railroad systems all the way across the country just to haul passengers. That would eliminate a lot of the driving. A lot of us baby boomers are tired of driving, tired of flying, and I really think that would create a lot of jobs. And on this minimum wage, leave it alone until you turn 21, and then after 21, then call it a living wage, and then get it up there to 12 or something an hour that people, could live on. And thank you very much for C-SPAN, and I really hope Elizabeth Warren jumps in here and runs for president.
Okay.
Thanks.
Tim from Virginia, thank you for the call.
In the final analysis, I agree. My bias is that we've missed an opportunity. Interest rates have been very low. If we're going to invest in rebuilding American infrastructure, which we need to do at some juncture, this was the moment, and I think we're coming pretty close to having blown it. That is, rates are probably going to go back up. That's one of the reasons the stock market is in a tailspin, is we're all concerned that the Federal Reserve Board will raise interest rates, and when they do, it'll cost a lot more to rebuild those bridges that are falling down.
Michael has this point. Again, you can share us your tweet at CSPAN-WJ. He says the following: the American economy is the tallest midget in the room compared to all others except China, which is not an open economy.
One of the realities that we face going forward is that in the old days, we were the biggest when we competed with the Japanese, when we competed with the Germans. We were 2 to 3 times their size. China, Brazil, India, those other developing nations were not in the game, but they've become capitalists now too in their own way. So going forward, they have the bodies, the numbers of people to make them a very big economy. Our only advantage is that we can build a more highly skilled workforce, and we need to pay a lot more attention to that than we are.
From Sandy Beach, Mr. Carnevale, I think Obama and the Dems should get all the credit deserved for this disastrous economy. The reckoning arrives in 2016. How do you respond to that sentiment?
Well, I think the numbers just don't support that. That is, the economy went into a tailspin in the last few years of the Bush administration. I don't have a bipartisan story about that. It's really something that happened on Wall Street in New York, not in Washington. And we basically overheated the economy in the 90s, and it crashed. That left both President Bush in the last year or so of his administration and then President Obama with a real cleanup problem. That is, an economy that was in a tailspin to the point where we really were risking economic collapse. And we're just now coming out of it. It has been going on 8, and I suspect there's 2 more years in the effects of that. But I do think the next president, whoever he or she is, will be able to claim a good economy, and both Obama and to some extent Bush, who did the right thing as he was going out the door, get credit for that.
We'll go to Joan next from La Crosse, Wisconsin. How long have you been retired, Joan?
Oh, gosh, about 20 years already.
Go ahead. If you could do me a favor, turn the volume. We're getting a little bit of feedback, and we'll hear your question or comment much better.
Just hold it. I'll turn it. Actually, I'm going to just put it on mute so
Perfect.
I wouldn't be getting... Okay, go ahead.
No, you go ahead. We can hear from you. What's your question or comment?
Pardon?
What's your question or comment?
Oh, I have a comment about everything. I mean, not everything. I guess education, since I'm a retired teacher. I think what our governor has done is a disaster to our state. He's supposed to be for education reform. If education reform is his policy, he's cutting everything dealing with education in our state. As you can tell, he's not one of my favorites, being a retired teacher. But I heard just that in La Crosse they've had a shortage of teachers already, and that's not a surprise to me what he's done to our state. That's my opinion on education. I have opinions on other things, but I guess I'm for Bernie Sanders at this point. I think he's for real people. We need someone who's for real people instead of for the billionaires.
Thank you, Joan.
One of the things that we're seeing is that we had a bad economy for so many years. First, it hurt the men. That is, we lost jobs in construction, manufacturing, and mostly in male domains where males are very highly concentrated. In the recovery, the men are coming back, but what's been very noticeable is that in the recovery, we've had a collapse of public budgets because revenues are down, and now the public economy is in trouble, and that hurt females the most, especially teachers. So now we're having a very predictable swing in which we stopped hiring teachers, got rid of a lot of teachers, and now we're facing real shortages. And that will happen in a number of other areas as well, if we're lucky, if the economy keeps growing.
This is a hard copy of your report. Where can people read it if they're interested?
Just go to cew.georgetown.edu and they can pull a copy off.
George is next from Hudson, Florida. Good morning.
Good morning. I want to cover the low wage, the minimum wage. It seems that the jobs used to be, they were more for school kids, after school and things like this. And somehow they've evolved into kind of like a career thing, and they just weren't made for that. Also, it seems that over the years, from personal experience, being retired, I was able to learn enough for skilled blue-collar worker jobs, welding and things like that, heavy equipment operators. And we tended to make very good money and have good benefits. So I think I'm a follower of Mike Rowe, and he seems to have his finger right on the button when it comes to things like that. There is a lot of good jobs out there. You just have to be willing to learn, because they can never take away from you what you learn, and you can move on if you have to. And the more you know, the more money you can make. So thank you very much, C-SPAN. I watch you.
Thank you, George.
One of the things that is really very striking about the current economy is just how different it is from the old industrial economy. In the 1970s, 75% of working Americans had high school or less, and they were doing fine. The vast majority were in the middle class. Now, we've got a situation where pretty much 60% of the jobs now require at least some post-secondary education, not necessarily a 4-year degree from Harvard, but a certificate, an industry-based certification. So in the old days, people learned their job on the job. Now, you've got to have at least some education or training after high school to get on the job so you can begin to learn there.
Next is Liz joining us from Marlton, New Jersey. Good morning. Welcome to the conversation, Liz.
Good morning. I'm calling in. I'm a recent retiree as of July 1st, and again from the career in teaching. I think the definition for good jobs and is probably pretty accurate that your guest is using. The main thing I think is determining the difference is there's been a move since the Reagan administration to try to decimate unions and to make sure that the weight of all the things that an employee needs, like retirement, health benefits, are shouldered on the backs of the employee more than the employer. And we need to, I think, if we're going to have any chance of creating the good jobs, of sustaining a middle class, you've got to get more of this workforce unionized. And that has been poo-pooed for 30 to 40 years. We can't do it. It's a global economy. It's this, it's that, it's something else. But throughout the period that union membership has went down, so has these good jobs.
Thank you, Liz. We'll get a response.
One of the interesting changes I've seen in my time following the economy is that it used to be that unions bargained for people, and that's how they got their wages and health care benefits. As unions have collapsed as a source of political power, the government has become the union of last resort for most Americans, which is why I think we got Obamacare. That is, we're going to settle these issues in government and not in particular workplaces between unions and employers. Puts an enormous pressure on government to try and respond to a whole nation's workspace problems. And I think going forward, more and more, the government is going to have to be the place where this kind of work gets done.
We're getting a lot of good questions and interesting comments. You can share your thoughts with us on Twitter at CSPANWJ. And there's this from J.R. Redding. What is your opinion of TPP, the Trade Promotion Authority, and the very near-term trade agreements?
I'm, like a lot of people, schizophrenic on this issue. I think in the end, trade benefits the American economy, but it does not benefit all Americans. And that's, I think, been reasonably clear since the late 1960s. And we've not done much to take care of people who are hurt by trade, because they're almost never the same people who get help. People who lose their jobs are quite distinct from people who get their jobs because of trade. So in a product like your iPad or your iPod or a very modern kind of product, only about 5% of the value of that product comes from manufacturing, and that manufacturing is done overseas. 95% of the value is in the value of the information, the internet, the marketing, the design. So we picked up those jobs and we lost the manufacturing jobs and got them done much more cheaply overseas. So the consumer won, but a lot of workers lost, and we didn't do much to help them when that happened. I think if we're going to have open and free trade, there has to be a bargain between American workers and the American government, those who benefit from trade and those who don't.
Our guest, Tony Carnevale, who is the director of the Center on Education and the Workforce at Georgetown University. Jeff from Crofton, Nebraska, good morning to you.
Good morning. I got to tell you, it was obvious that when they put the stimulus out there, that it was a total waste. I mean, even the president, with his little joke on the side, I guess there weren't that many shovel-ready jobs after all. So that money was wasted. It went to the blue states, and they paid off their bills. And in the end, the next president, we know, is going to have such a hard time, because the first thing the Fed's going to do is raise the interest rates, and we're all going to be in trouble. That's going to affect the stock market and everybody in the entire world. So we best be ready for that, because that's going to happen.
Your response?
In the end, one of the simplest laws of economics is when you spend money, you spend it on something, whether it's a manufacturing good or a service or whatever, and when you spend that money, somebody gets it, if it doesn't go into savings or go into people's bank accounts. And so, and the money in the stimulus package got spent. And when you spend money, it either saves people's jobs or it creates new jobs. And in this case, it saved a lot of people's jobs. On the other issue, I think it's fair to say that I agree with you. That is, I think we're much too sensitive to inflation, which is what raising interest rates is all about. Inflation has been banished from the American economy really since the Jimmy Carter era, a long time ago. And I don't see it rearing its head anywhere anytime soon. I think we need to continue to grow the economy and not try to slow it down, so that in fear of inflation that I think isn't there.
Chris is next from Roscoe, Illinois. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. It's a great show this morning.
We're glad to hear from you. Now, tell us your story. You are currently out of work. Is that correct?
I'm out of work. My husband is out of work. We are both over the age of 55. I have a graduate degree, and my husband has a bachelor's degree. He was an engineer, and I was in medical sales. And both of us, we're accustomed to having incomes that were over $80,000 a year. I also have probably 10 friends, at least 10 friends. Again, over the age of 50, we all had really good jobs, all college educated, lost those jobs, and some of us have been out of work for longer than 5 years. We get interviews, and nobody hires us. And the people that do want to hire us either say that, well, you're overqualified, or they only want to pay, and I'm not even seeing $55,000. They want to pay $30,000. In fact, when I go and do job searches online, there are very few jobs that want to pay more than $40,000 a year for sales, and many of them have now turned into 1099 positions, meaning they just want an independent contractor. So I'd like to hear the speaker address what the prospects are for people who are over 55 and have been out of work.
Hey, Chris, before we get his response, let me turn the question to you. What do you think your personal prospects are moving ahead?
That's difficult to say. I mean, I've had some good interviews where I've felt I've done very well, and I've had the recruiters tell me that I was the second choice. And they usually have said that I was the second choice because I had too much of a certain type of experience. So again, they're giving me this overqualified. I'm very concerned. We have about 8 months of savings, and I'm very concerned that if we don't find jobs soon, that we are going to lose our house, which is really the bulk of our retirement.
Thank you for sharing your story with us. We'll get a response.
One of the characteristics of this recession, which makes it unusual, it is somewhat similar to the last two recessions, which is to say, this is something that's beginning to happen every recession, is that we're getting more and more long-term unemployment, and most people would assume that that's occurring among people with high school degrees, let's say, lower skill, lower wage workers in retail, food, and other kinds of industries. That's not the case. Longer-term unemployment is more and more divided pretty much equally between people with college educations and people who don't have college education. So in the end, the numbers do say, and they do say that in the end, if you do have a college education and work experience, which sounds like you and your husband have a lot of that, then in the end you'll get another job, but on average, you're going to lose about, if you're in the averages, you're going to lose about 25% of your previous wage and probably lose the value of benefits. That is, your benefits won't be as good as they used to be. So we're now living in a world where when it rains long enough and hard enough, a lot of people get wet. It's not just about what happens to low-wage workers anymore, because so many of us are now college educated. So shifts in the economy hurt just about everybody.
Our next caller is from Douglasville, Georgia. Edward, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you for C-SPAN and Washington Journal. My question is this: you haven't addressed the global economy, and my second part of the situation is a solution. Why is it that other people from other countries can come into the United States and make the same rates that we do? Why isn't it that when they come here, they have to earn citizenship, and then their rate will increase? Otherwise, their rate of pay should be the same as the country that they come from.
Do you want to respond?
One of the historic powerhouses in the American economy has always been immigration, and it's when immigrants do come here, what you see even with skilled immigrants is they earn less here than Native Americans do in the same job and the same occupation with the same education, but they earn a lot more than people like them in the country they come from, which is what makes us so attractive. That is, you may come to the United States and end up as an engineer and drive a cab for a few years, but ultimately you'll get a job that pays a lot more than the job you got in the country that you came from. So immigration is one of the sources of our fresh talent. We're now struggling with the notion about whether or not we ought to be focused more on skilled immigration versus less skilled immigration. But in the end, it's just not deemed fair in our system that people have to take a lower wage because they are immigrants, especially when they're legal immigrants.
One other point from the caller in Illinois, both she and her husband, both out of work, both in their mid-50s, and this advice from a viewer who says, when they tell you you're overqualified, tell them that you are looking to scale back. So that's a perfect fit for you. What about that technique?
I think whatever you can do to get through the door is what you ought to do. I understand unemployment. I've studied it for a long time, and I know what it does to people, and it is devastating. All the happy talk about how losing a job is fortuitous because some other door will open up and all that sort of thing is, at least in the data, it doesn't look like it's true. So I think in the end, whatever it is you have to do to get through the door, because as you've learned, all of us learn, is you can get all the education you want, but you've got to use that and whatever experience you have to get a ticket inside the economy and working. Once you're inside and working, you can then make your way by moving from one job to the next. So the key is get through the door.
Our last caller is Tom from Charlottesville, Virginia. Good morning.
Good morning, sir. I wanted to ask your guest what he thought about the cost of college, since college is so important these days. If he had any suggestions for possibly changing the cost structure of college and improving the competition among colleges, or maybe a new type of college that highlights more the basic skills that people need instead of possible classes that may not be pertinent to earning and living in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
The American Post-Secondary Education and Training System, which is the broader name for college, because it now includes lots of different kinds of institutions and different kinds of awards or degrees. There are 30 million Americans now that have industry-based certifications that have nothing to do with college, and those are very high earning. But the current system we've built is untenable. We simply can't afford it. We're now spending $400 billion a year on post-secondary education and training, and the government has the money to pay for that. That is, most of the government money is now moving toward retirees, people who look like me, frankly. And we're now underinvesting in our young people and our workers in a fairly dramatic way. Part of the problem is we've built a college structure or an education and training structure that has become way too expensive and very inefficient. You have to ask, why can you get at this desk we're sitting at within 30 miles of here, there are probably 40 anthropology programs. Why aren't there 10? So there's a huge inefficiency here. And what's happening, unfortunately, is our college education system is whiter and more affluent than it's ever been. And there's more and more stratification in access to college, so that low-income students, working-class students, poor kids, minorities, especially Hispanics and African Americans, more and more go to community colleges and get job training, and more the people who go to 4-year bachelor's degree institutions that get very strong general education and access to the professions, they're more and more from affluent and white families.
The report is available online at georgetown.edu. Tony Carnevale, who is with Georgetown, thank you very much. The report is called Good Jobs Are Back, and College Graduates Are First in Line. We appreciate it.
Thank you.